Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Dana, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Good morning, Mary. Thank you so much for having me.
It's lovely to be talking with you today, and I'm excited to hear all about what you're up to. And I love what you've been doing in the conflict resolution space and trying to help people to have difficult conversations. But before we get to all of that, I would like to hear about the first job you ever had as a young person.
Hmm. I began cleaning houses when I was about, I guess, 12 or 13, and I did that for most of my teenage years. Yeah, so I really started out kind of on an entrepreneurial basis and it stayed that way until I became a dancer, and then I started working in companies. Yeah.
So, being an entrepreneur at 12, 13, trying to find, ways to make pocket change or whatever we want money for when we're that young, how did that come about and what kind of experience was that like for you?
It came about because I was looking for some pocket money, and we had a neighborhood of a very well-connected neighborhood who were, always thinking about how to support children as well, I think. And so people in the neighborhood hired me to come by and clean, and the experience was great because it really taught me that I could make systems that could support me, and that there are people who I could reach out to who would support me. Yeah, so overall, it was really empowering, and it was also freeing because as I was a teenager, I was also studying to be an artist, to be a dancer. And so I could fit it into my schedule, which was, erratic and changing. Yeah.
A lot of people's first jobs are, they're on a farm or something local or something like McDonald's, right? These sorts of
Hmm.
fast food jobs, which are can really be very formative when people have these first jobs. But I think it's interesting when children look into the world and say, well, what can I make happen, right? I'm not old
Mm.
enough, or it doesn't fit my schedule to work maybe at the local pizza shop. What can I do? And I think it's pretty interesting how being supported by a community, but then what that does for the person as they're developing in those really formative years.
Hmm.
So you are an artist, a dancer. Have you always wanted to dance? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I guess I remember my grandmother said I was always dancing when I was a little kid. And I started early I grew up in Minneapolis where there was a wonderful public school program where in the afternoon you could go to the theater school at the Children's Theater, which is a professional children's theater. And so I was there for many years and got training in all kinds of different things. And part of that was dance. And I became quite connected to the dance part of it there, and got more and more excited by it, and eventually decided to try to make it as a dancer. Yeah.
I don't know much about the dance world. I suppose the only thing that I know is from film and whatnot, and it sounds very difficult to get into, to sustain, hard on the body, seemingly very rewarding. But um, uh, can you tell us what is it like to be a professional dancer?
Yeah, I had good fortune to end up in places that were very generative, where ideas were welcome, where there was a lot of collaboration, and things changed and shifted over time according to what was going on in the world and who was in the company. So getting into dance is, it's definitely a difficult field for sure. It takes a lot of training. You have to already be fully trained essentially by the time you're, 17, 18. And getting into initially I couldn't get into anything. Couldn't get into a school or a company, but I kept trying, and got my first real job was with a tiny company in northern Minnesota, which was a great place to start because there was only, I think, 7 of us in the company, and we got to do a lot of stuff. And then eventually I left there and went to got a job in North Carolina at the North Carolina Dance Theater, which is a touring company. So small touring companies get on buses and travel around in the United States, if you're in the United States, and do performances. So it's a very demanding physically, like you mentioned, very demanding job. At the same time, it's fantastically what would be the right word? you're in a space that's like an emergency, but with a positive a positive energy. And you're connecting to the people you're on stage with, you're in training, you're connecting to the people who are watching and thinking about what it means to be in a body, to be moving through time in a body, to be communicating with the body. And then eventually I went got a job in Germany in the Frankfurt Ballet, which where I ended up staying for 30 years because it was a just a wonderful place. And that was an internationally touring company, so we were on the road then as well. And in that company, I worked as a performer, so as a dancer and an actress, and I wrote texts for the pieces, and I choreographed, directed pieces. So we all did a lot of different things. We really moved between arenas of action, and so it was really exciting in that way.
For first professional jobs, right? So away from house cleaning, to be that young and to be, doing what you love, which is of course also a business, because the company can't stay afloat if the revenue's not there. So,
Mm.
and and when you're touring, you're living with your colleagues who they're your work colleagues. Many times, I'm sure they're friends as well. How did you, I imagine that's really rife for the possibility of conflict, right? When you're on top of
Mm-hmm.
each other and you're tired and it's physically and mentally demanding and stressful. How did your younger self deal with the kinds of conflicts that came up?
As you were talking about that, I just realized something, which is that in North Carolina Dance Theater, we're on this bus where you're definitely on top of each other and conflicts can arise. And there was a woman who was older than me. We were all quite young, and she had started. She was from Texas, Terry Lynn, and they started something that they called Cujo. Like I got Cujo because there was that book Cujo where there was a rabid dog. And so when I think of it now, I realize actually it was a really good strategy because it slightly abstracted it. It made it something that you could put between you that wasn't about the person, but it was like, I have Cujo. I need to get in my bunk and get away. In that particular company, there was a way of naming it as something that was temporary and passing, didn't have anything to do with anybody else. And there was a space for that to be allowed and then to move ahead. So in those companies, we also had, I had a lot of good fortune as I went along. One of the dancers was a company rep. So he was quite skilled in naming what dancers needed and bringing that to the administration, and and helping us also articulate that. So I think I had some good teachers along the way about what it means to not just kind of circle in frustration, but instead to say, okay, what is the topic? What are we thinking about here? What might need to change in order for us to move toward something that's going to work for everybody? What's the constructive change that this conflict is proposing, which is now what I think is kind of a basic question to any conflict.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What a gift to have somebody that you are spending time with who is there to help navigate the conflict. So
Mm-hmm.
many organizations don't have a person like an ombuds or access to someone who helps de-escalate situations and conflict is normal. This is just a part of life. And if many times though we do need external help. So how wonderful to have somebody help you process and move through that. So as you said, you don't have to circle. And I love the Cujo. I mean, because you're not saying you're the rabid dog, right? You're just saying, hey, this is going on. I need some space. And that shorthand signal,
Mm-hmm.
that's just really so elegant. It says so much and it can de-escalate the whole situation because many times we just need a timeout. We need a pause. We need distance
Mm-hmm.
instead of, piling on or no way, as you said, to get away. But if we can get away, we can shift our perspective. And gosh, there's a lot there to really think about how simple that is, but how it can be really help people to have a continued good working environment.
Mm-hmm. And I think about that. I was just doing a mediation the other day where I was noticing the same thing that when there's old stories, old repetitions that are like walls that feel like they're just there, if we do the same thing, if we like Cujoize it and say, okay, there's this particular wall that you know really well, and It feels like it's solid. But if we take it and give it an object form and say, okay, oh, there's that wall again. Ah. So rather than like running right into what your part of the wall is and what's wrong with them, instead to make a simple shortcut, like you say, a shorthand to say, ah, there's that wall. We both know it. We're both going to be prepared for when it comes up again. Sometimes, I'll work with people, they'll just develop like a stupid hand gesture or something. So they don't have to say, like, now we've run into the issue of this again, but rather, here it is again. Okay, we know this. We're going to have a conscious approach to how we deal with this. So developing this conflict culture that says, okay, things are going to come up for sure, and they'll probably repeat, and we're not going to be able to just get rid of them out the window. We're going to need to work with it over and over, and until we understand what the wall's made of, until we can have a conscious alternative to just kind of banging our heads against it. And I think it is that same kind of process of giving a slight abstraction so that people aren't just inside the thing and overwhelmed by it, but able to say, oh, there's that. Okay, there's this too. It's not the totality of us. It's
Right.
one thing that's happening between us. And so we can say, oh, right. Okay, here we are again. All right. What approach do we take here?
Right. I love the
Yeah.
idea of a hand signal or something that signals to the other because we don't know what's going on in the mind of somebody else. And I might start feeling that old, and I love the idea of the old story. We hear
Mm-hmm.
these things and it's repeating on tape, but to me, that is very arresting. An old story tells me maybe it's tired, maybe it's time to put this to rest, but it certainly names it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having a name or having a signal can tell somebody else who maybe they're feeling just fine, they can say, I'm telling you, I'm not feeling fine. My husband and I
Mm.
have a saying when we say Team Brown. My last name is Brown, we're Browns. And so that means like when we're on vacation or something's starting to go sideways, I'll
Mm-hmm.
say something like Team Brown, or he'll say Team Brown, and we're like, oh, that's right. We are on the same team. We may disagree about
Mm.
this, but it's just sort of this resetting of, okay, we are partners. We're not
Yeah.
adversaries. And that kind of shorthand in a company, in a culture, can really help people move forward.
Mm-hmm. And really, like you say, that it's not about the words or a formula, but it's really about the mindset that if you find yourself like, ooh, I'm slipping into the mindset of that old story, what it means to collectively be able to say, okay, yeah, let's shift into the mindset we want to be in,
Mm.
which is to think about how to work on these things together. Because I think one thing that I find oftentimes doesn't work and makes things worse is if there is kind of a formula, like in this company, we do this. And then people are like, oh, Jesus, it's the conflict resolution strategy. And if instead we move away from formula and move toward this idea of like, what's our actual mindset, which is
Mhm.
an agreement that we make about what we're focused on together, where we're putting our attention, because we know what the impact is if we put it this other way.
Mhm. I think I like that word slip too. It is easy to
Hmm.
slip into old habits. It's
Yeah.
easy to not recognize you're feeling offended or
Mhm.
sometimes the accumulation of the paper cuts, or we don't see them in the beginning of whatever's going on.
Yeah.
But if we notice, we're going to slip into these different mindsets, but we want something else, right? Conflict resolution is about intention, it's about personal
Mm.
empowerment.
Hmm.
And if we just recognize, I love what you said about formulas because I think where conflict resolution goes wrong is we make these all in good faith, all in, this real desire to help people, but we forget it's about people. Like if you get human nature wrong, if you don't understand what it's
Mm.
like for the individual in the messiness to talk or to solve or to be in that organization,
Hmm.
all the formulas in the world aren't going to work because they're not going to do it. It's not going to feel authentic. It's going to feel like you said, oh, we're just pulling this out and now I'm checking this box instead of what do I want, right? That mindset
Hmm.
of what do we as this team actually want to do to move forward?
Yeah. And that's really my focus overall is, sometimes it's really helpful to have a third party, but most of the time people can't have a third party. They can't afford it. There's nobody there, whatever it is. And so I really care about how do individuals develop their own capacity to take that step back and to focus, like you say, on what matters, and how we articulate the difference between talking about what matters to us and what's wrong with the other person. Oftentimes those get stuck together. So
Right.
helping people like develop the capacity to really notice the difference between all these elements that are present and what the decisions are that we're making around those.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, it is wonderful to have somebody like you had in your company who was this rep who was there if there was an issue or who he could see what was going on and be proactive. But
Hmm.
most of us are just realistically not going to have that luxury.
Yeah.
And while it's lovely to have, it's better to develop that capacity yourself because for the time when that person isn't around or whatever it may be, but for us to no matter what organization you're in or where you are in life, the more you develop those competencies and confidence,
Hmm.
right? And then wherever you go, you're more self-possessed, right? You bring that with you into every situation. The more you do it, the more you practice it, right? The more you become into a person who sees, as I see that is your book that is coming out in a few months, that conflict is an opportunity. And sometimes we say, I don't want that opportunity, but to really see it for what it is quite an opportunity.
Yeah. And that these things, and what I find really exciting about it too is that people don't need to buy into something. They don't need to be like, okay, I'm going to adopt a conflict approach, but to recognize we're already fully in it. We always already have an approach. And so rather than having to feel like we have to step into something, it's just a matter of like looking at where I am. What is my current, what am I currently paying attention to, for example? What decisions am I currently aware that I'm making? And what it means to keep developing that, like you say, that confidence to recognize, like, okay, yeah, actually, I can shift my attention if I'm like getting stuck in attack and defense or some other destructive thing. I can step back and say, oh, it's Cujo. Okay. Um, I'm going to shift my attention now to this level of like where I can actually make some impact in the direction that I want to, not in the direction that's habitual and ends up in sorrow and harm,
Mm.
but rather like, okay, I got sidetracked there. I'm going to step back now and say, all right, what matters to me here? Do I know what matters to the other person? Have I told them what matters to me?
Mm.
What is the question between us? Are we, do we have the same question between us? Is the question that we think we're working, is that even useful? If it's not, what's missing? What needs to be brought in? What information don't we have yet? What is it that we're looking for? Like, what would the request be that we might make of each other that's not about like changing your personality or stopping being impossible, but really connected connected to what we care about. What is it that I might be asking of you? Not in like a demand, but to let you know where I am, what I need, and to ask what you need. Yeah.
I just love that so much. I mean, that's curiosity and asking all
Mm.
these questions. I think so many times we feel like, well, we know the answer. As you said, they're impossible.
Right.
They're jerks. They're doing this to
Yeah.
me. I'm this innocent bystander. And they obviously know this bothers me or what I want, and they're being obstructionists, right? We
Hmm.
supply all these details instead of asking questions. I taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I remember
Hmm.
when I was in college, one of my professors said, when I started studying philosophy, that the most important thing in philosophy is not about answering the questions, but getting the right questions. If you
Yeah.
don't spend time developing the right questions, then you'll never get the answer because you're trying to solve this particular you've got a question, you're going in that direction. But
Mm.
if it's the wrong question, even if you get to the end, you get the answer, it's not the answer that you really wanted because you were looking in the wrong direction. And when you were speaking, I was thinking, all these beautiful questions that we could at any moment stop and ask ourselves to really start getting curious and thinking about what is going on? What do I want to have happen? What does the other person want? All of these curious asking questions that are going to
Hmm.
lead us to actual resolution, restoration, and a moving forward instead of playing these old stories.
Yeah. And that's actually how I decided to focus this new book that I have that's coming out, which is on questions that are focused around the decisions that we make within there. Because I find, like you mentioned before, conflict is so destabilizing. We can get so caught up and it's so overwhelming when the emotions are where we're circling around or we're stuck in attack and defense and to have questions that can help you take a step back and say, okay, I need to think about this differently. Let me just like look at a few things in here. And do we start to unpack it so it becomes not this big ball of stress, but a place where there's action is possible. And so I think a lot about conflict in terms of action, because I see that's the place where we have power, where we can recognize, okay, not kind of like you mentioned before, not what the other person, what's wrong with them and they're impossible and not what they made me do or they made me feel, but rather to really find freedom internally by recognizing they didn't make me do anything or they didn't make me feel anything. I had a response based on something. Okay, what was it based on? What is it that I need under that? What am I internally doing? Because I find 90% of the kind of, let's say, the work in conflict happens internally or it doesn't happen before we start dumping stuff on other people. So
Right.
there's this internal space, there's the interpersonal space, and then there's the structural space. All of those things are impacting us. And if our attention isn't mobile enough, then we can recognize those and look at the questions in all those different arenas. So we're not trying to, for example, answer a interpersonal question when it's actually a structural problem.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about conflict with, I do think it's what I love about this space is that it is about personal empowerment.
Mm.
And I do many times in conflict, as you said, it can be so overwhelming. And we give our power away because we say, I can't move until you
Mm.
apologize, until you change your ways, until they fire you, until this is recognized, and now I'm stuck because I'm waiting for somebody else. And yet, right, freedom is about action, really
Mm.
seeing what our actions are, which is what are our possibilities. And when we when we decide we have to wait for the other, we're just in this holding pattern and we're not curious and we don't look at what our actual options are. We tell ourselves a particular narrative, which is largely false. I
Mm.
mean, we're not talking about crimes being committed against
Yeah,
people, right? We're talking
yeah,
about the normal kinds of things that happen at work, but
yeah.
can be very, very painful as well.
Hmm.
So, Dina, how did you get into the space from being an artist, a dancer, a choreographer, or working with this Germany ballet company for over 30 years? How did you move into this space?
Mm. Well, I guess at a certain point in my life, I just was experiencing a lot of conflict around me and seeing myself suffering and other people suffering and thinking, there's just got to be some other way to do this than I'm currently doing it. And actually, a friend of mine dragged me to a workshop of Marshall Rosenberg, who started nonviolent communication.
Yeah.
And so I went to it, and I was like, whatever. But then somehow in the course of listening to him, it was just a talk for like an hour and a half. Um, I suddenly I suddenly had that an actual kind of light bulb experience, which I've never had before, of like, wow, it doesn't have to be the way it is.
Mhm.
And from that point, I started just sort of studying for myself, just to get a sense of like how, like you say, how can I move out of this feeling of being stuck inside systems that other people are imposing on me, and recognizing that I'm always free to make all kinds of different decisions. And as I began changing the way I approached the difficulty that came up, I also saw how the situation itself would unfold differently, and other people could respond differently because they're receiving different things from me. And so eventually I went and got a degree because I wanted to study more and more. I got a degree in conflict studies and mediation, I guess about 15 years ago, and I began working in conflict alongside my work as an artist. And then about 10 years ago, I stopped dancing and I've been working full time in the field since then.
Marshall Rosenberg, absolutely fabulous, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
nonviolent communication. that book just so resonated with me. He says at one point, and I say this all the time when I'm talking with people, that the words that we use were either building bridges, we're connecting, or we're distancing ourselves.
Yeah.
And and I think that's so powerful because many times we think about conflict as this big thing that happened, as this particular event where somebody is yelling in a meeting or whatever. But all relationships are built in the everyday. How I
Mhm.
greet that person or don't greet that person, the things that I say and think about that person or don't. And it is in the everyday that we build those bonds. And so everything that we say, we have this opportunity to mend, to build bridges, to strengthen our relationships, or we can choose to weaken those bonds. And one, of course, wonderful way, I think, to deal with conflict effectively in our relationships is way before a conflict ever begins, right?
Mhm.
Is how do we lay that groundwork of trust and charity towards one another? Uh, because to really be open with somebody takes a kind of vulnerability appropriate to the space, right? When
Yeah.
we're at work, there's a kind of appropriateness in our personal lives. But the more that we think about the nature and the quality of our relationships
Mhm.
in the good times. When the inevitable happens, when we disagree, then there's the great possibility that we can navigate it in a healthy way, which actually strengthens our relationships as conflict is an opportunity, as you say.
Yeah, and I think about that. Actually, I think about it a lot in relationship to dance work because dancers every day come back, they spend an hour and a half doing a class every morning. So you do essentially the same type of actions, the same categories of actions, and you don't do it to perfect them, but to reawaken the idea in yourself because the
Mm,
body is mobile, so it doesn't you don't learn something and it stays, but rather it adapts to what's happening. So you go into a class and you reawaken these ideas and your relationship to them and how you embody them as things that you become that are come from you,
mm,
not as an external form that you're taking on. And
mm,
I see it the same in conflict is that in like you say in every day, constantly we're practicing, we're building the mindset that we will fall into in conflict. So if you're a dancer and you don't train, it's too late to train when you're on stage. And it's the same thing in conflict. You
Right.
can't get in there and say, okay, now I'm in a conflict. Now I'm going to really learn how to be curious and listen for what matters. And because it's too late, you're overwhelmed and you don't have any practice because we go cognitively to what we've done the most, of course. And so to recognize, I think a lot about curiosity as a skill.
Mm,
So it's not something that just sort of pops up in us. I mean, it does pop up as a natural human thing, but the capacity to stay with that attention when you're stressed out, when you're angry or afraid or sad, is something that we build, like you say, on this daily basis with micro actions, like when we're slightly annoyed, like you say, with something that your husband does or whatever it is, to in that moment practice curiosity and actively practice it so that you
mhm,
recognize this is an action.
mm,
The other habit is also an action. I just don't recognize it as an action because it just feels like what I do, you know.
right.
And to recognize that we're constantly there's no blank slate. Everything we do is a choice in terms of action, and a lot of times a lot of it's habitual. So to bring those habits into visibility,
Mm,
to understand what they're made of, how why they got there in the first place. Sometimes they came there for a good reason, so we need to also understand that and say, okay, right, that used to help me with feeling safe or whatever it is. Okay, now it is no longer serving me.
right.
It's probably going to pop up, and then I can say, there's that wall again. Okay, and I'm going to consciously take an alternative action, and to do that on a daily basis. So then, like you say, when we get into conflict, we can be there with a curious self, with a full self, and we can still be angry and everything, but we can be angry with curiosity. Like, oh God, I'm so pissed off about this because this really matters to me. What's up? What are you thinking here? What's really important to you? I need to understand better what's happening. Yeah.
That's a wonderful example of curiosity with anger because somebody listening might say, how is that possible? Like, how could you
Mm.
authentically do that? And I think it's like me thinking, I'm going to go run a 5K tomorrow after not training at all and sitting on the couch. Well, yeah, that's completely unrealistic.
Hmm.
Could I could maybe walk it or try, but I'm not going to place very well. And it's unreasonable to think that I'd be able to. So, if you want the capacity to be present and understand your own emotional responses, but also for them not to be destructive or completely overwhelm you and to maintain your values and to have that curiosity, that takes practice. And as you said, we already have habits about how we deal with conflict because just conflict is in the fabric of our life. We don't see them, but we
Mm.
have habituated ourselves. And habits, if you do them long enough, they just become like second nature. Like you get in your car and you don't like say, okay, now what am I doing here? If you
Hmm.
feel that way, you should get out, right? Don't drive, right? Because you don't know what's happening, right?
Yeah.
But we can do that if we practice habitually healthy conflict resolution skills, then those can become our default, right? And that is exciting when we see
Mhm.
that we're actually living in concert with the values that we have, this wanting to be in relationship with others, wanting to
Mhm.
not just vent and lash out, but to to really understand while also being able to be integrated in our own self and have our own emotional responses and interact with others. Trying to put all that together.
Yeah, I love that. And because I think one of the things that people, when they start thinking about developing, or working on their conflict approach, there might be a little resistance because people think, oh, I don't want it to be unnatural. I don't want it to be, something weird that I feel like I have to do. And I think to recognize that it's all a practice. You're already practicing. You don't have to decide to, you're already doing it. And the question, like you brought up there, is what I'm practicing aligned with my values and where I'm actually trying to go? If not, what might I want to shift? So that the practice of conflict is not about any strategy or tools or whatever. It's about an increasing awareness of where you are, what's happening, what you're choosing to do, what other people are choosing, what matters, and then asking this basic question, which is what what might it look like if we found this way forward? The the man who the choreographer who is the director of the company in Germany, who's also my husband, has this kind of basic, very curious mindset where he was always asking and still always asks questions like, "What else might this also be?" So
Mm,
not like let's get rid of what it is, but what else might this also be that we haven't yet noticed? So I think bringing this kind of um, mindset of thinking, okay, there is always mobility and transformation possible in every situation. And it comes out of the materials of the present. It's not like we have to get rid of this and get the right stuff in here,
mm,
but rather to look at the present. What is here? What does it need? What are the energies that are present? And what does it mean for us to think about what else might this be,
mm.
given where we all want to go?
That's a wonderful question. I love that. Conflict resolution is very creative endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many times we tell ourselves a story, the other person can't change, nothing can change. This is the way
Mm-hmm.
that it is, which is well, if this is the way that it is, then that's that, right? I'm done thinking.
Mm.
And that therefore we get stuck. But it is this creative endeavor, and many times we want to solve problems just by ourselves, and sometimes we can, but many times it is in the process of the conversation. It is that actual that it's generative that we are
Mm.
creating with another person. And that's difficult, especially if the other person we feel doesn't care about us or has caused us pain, or we feel like they're misunderstanding us or minimizing us. We're like, I don't want to create with that person. I don't want to
Right.
be generous with that person. And so that's why I think, as you said, so much of conflict resolution is, I agree, it's like 90%, as you said, ourself. We have to
Mm-hmm.
do the work. We have to be in the space of, well, what do we want? Do I want to be able to work with my colleague, or do I want to be upset every time I see that person? Do I want to collaborate for some better future? Or do I want this toxic environment? What do you want the most?
Yeah.
And really asking yourself those questions to say, okay, what next? If this is what I want, the path forward is I need to possibly have a conversation with this person, really getting into that space of seeing the other person as a person and not just the other or the obstruction to
Hmm.
mow through, but as a person. Conflict resolution, I think, is only going to work if you humanize the other person. Just like with mediation, you can't really compel somebody. I mean, I see it all the time. People are
Hmm.
voluntold to go to mediation at work. I'm like, well, it's not going to work if the person isn't willing
Hmm.
to meet the other person and try at least to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it gets back to this internal mindset that the recognition that, like you say, sometimes you might be able to solve something on your own, but usually we need the information from the other person. And often we don't have it about what's up with them, what they're caring about. And to also to recognize that, even if we don't like the other person, if we think they have some objectionable quality, whatever it is, we can still do good work together. And I think part of that, what makes that possible is to recognize first, we need each other's information in order to figure out a sustainable
Mm.
solution that's going to make sense for everybody. Because if it doesn't make sense for some of the people, it's not going to work. There'll be resentment and it'll fall apart. And then to recognize that even when we disagree on things, we can build power together. So, like you say, if we say, I don't want to deal with them, they're impossible, and I don't even, why should I have to talk to them? Because then we have also taken part of the power out of the room. Whereas if we say, okay, let's come together, figure out what's at the heart of this, recognize that the other person has certain kinds of power, that if we are willing to say, okay, it is possible for us to come together, it's probably possible. What if it is possible? Even if people are like, it's not possible. Well, what if it were? Like, so I find that's also a useful question. Okay, right now it seems impossible, but what if we were able to have it? And what if we were able to access the energies and the power that the different people have to move towards something that would make sense for everybody? What might that look like, just as a hypothetical?
Mm.
What would be the elements that we could think about accessing and moving toward? Yeah.
I love that. It's the imagination of the possible, like what could be.
Mm.
And if you don't have a vision, you're not going to move towards it,
Hmm.
right? So if you've already said that person's unreasonable, full stop, well, why are you going to talk to that person? But if
Hmm.
you imagine, well, this could get better and that could get better, and now we start picking at certain things, now we have an imagination, we have a path forward. And I think that's a lot of the work of a third party, right? Obviously, we're not telling anybody what to do. We're trying to make the space for them to imagine and for them to get curious and to start that conversation beyond the wants to the needs, right? What's really underlying here? I also like something that you said about, and I think it goes to what your husband is saying about accepting reality as is, right?
Mm.
What is given right
Hmm.
now, and and seeing that many times when we are caught in a conflict or caught in pain, we don't want to see that because we think it's not right, or
Hmm.
we have this strong idea of what justice is. But when we align our expectations to what is and what's possible, then it's interesting that we're going to get more of what we want.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that comes also back to this the recognition of what habits do I internally have? What is the outcome that I know comes from that?
Mm.
And really getting conscious of that. I was actually reading Shanti Deva, who's a Buddhist teacher from a long time ago this morning. He said he's talking to himself, but he's saying, I could either be born in a glowing lotus flower, or I could land in hell and be cut up into a million pieces with knives. And he's just talking about the impact of what we choose to do. We know the outcome is likely to be with each direction. We go in habit often toward the harmful one just because it's habit. And the more we build up our capacity to to recognize like, okay, I know what's going to happen if I go down that road. That that we can strengthen ourselves that way too, because sometimes people are like thinking, well, I don't want to have to be the big person here, or why do I have to be the one who's going to have this conversation? And it's that it's not about being right or doing the right thing, but it's about thinking, like you say, where do I want to get to? How do I want to be with people? What
Mhm.
situation do I want to build with people? And if I go down that route, um, where's that going to get me?
Mhm.
And then really consciously stepping back when you realize, like, I really want to go after this person because they're impossible. And I know that's not going to get me anywhere. So I'm going to shift away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, that daily practice.
Yeah, and I think the question is not, we want to in conflict say, who are you and what are you
Mm.
going to do? But the question is always, who am I? Who do
Mm-hmm.
I want to be? And I hear that too. Why do I have to be the bigger person? Well, who do you want to be?
Mm-hmm.
Who are you? It doesn't matter what anybody else does. Their actions have nothing to do with your actions. You can respond in the way that you want to respond. So who are you? How do you want to show up at this job, the next job, this relationship, this other relationship? That's you. So who is that?
Mm-hmm.
And really trying to figure that out, that very, I am drawn to the Stoics. I think there is something very
Mm.
powerful in recognizing what you can control. It's so many times we just get it in reverse. We think, well, it's so clear this other person is wrong and how they are in the world is wrong, and everybody knows it, so they're the problem. But the problem is our thinking about that, right?
Yeah.
We can choose to see that person as an obstructionist, or we could choose to see that person as being a being on the way. And this is who they are at this time. And
Mm.
they don't resonate with me, but maybe their mother loves them, right? You know, and my new saying is, that's not for me in my mind. Like, not everything is for me. Not every film I see, not every thing I come across. The world is not curated for me. So I can let other people like what they like, be who they are, and I can choose to be and go about the world the way that I want to go about the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to notice that that's true for everybody. And I think the getting back again to this question of what question is between us,
Mm,
that when in conflict, um, we find ourselves like rejecting and pushing away, and they're the problem, and there's nowhere to go, and I'm stuck. If we replace that question with that kind of mindset with the question of what constructive change do the tensions of this conflict propose? So
mm,
the idea that every conflict is proposing a constructive change, stepping into that mindset, even if we can't imagine what it is, the mindset of like, okay, there's tensions, there's a particular structure of, energies happening here, and they themselves are the information we need to understand how to move toward a constructive change. So we need to figure out what information's missing so that we can understand why those tensions are there,
yeah,
what they're proposing. So I think that the more we internally have this sense of possibility and this sense of curiosity, that's not like something we put on top of ourselves, but something we recognize, like, what am I asking myself? Am I asking myself what change is possible here? Am I asking uh, why why this conflict came up? What's it about? What's happening? What needs to be spoken, or what's afraid to be spoken, and what might help it be spoken? Yeah.
yeah. That's really wonderfully said. I love that idea of of looking and asking that question, that the conflict itself presents itself with the path forward, where so
Mm-hmm.
many times we just don't want to look at it because it's painful. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of pain, I mean, real pain, as you know, that people experience in a home, their in their work lives. And when we're caught up in that pain, it's like, the thorn in the lion's paw, it just makes
Mm.
everything so terrible. It's hard to see straight. And
Yeah.
so being able to, oh, it is a thorn and it is painful, but it isn't all of it's not all of everything, right?
Yeah.
Right sizing what is going on and addressing it and seeing it, and then you then you can, instead of kitchen sinking it, everything is wrong. What is it?
Hmm.
It is so much I see my work is helping people de-escalate to find out, it's not this emotion up here. What is it? What is that need? What are the needs? And
Yeah.
once a person can articulate that, these paths magically open up. It's quite a wonderful field to be in, this conflict resolution field, I believe.
Yeah, it can be so heartening.
So, Dana, can you tell us about a conflict that you have had and how you dealt with it?
Okay, let's see. Let me think of one. I have to think of one. I have to think of one. um, how about if I talk about what I did internally in a conflict?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I would, for example, working in companies, you're in a lot of different systems are happening, a lot of people, a lot of stuff, things are changing. And I used to just hate conflict and really try to manage it, try to talk people down, try to fix stuff behind the scene before anything happened, prevent anything from emerging. And what that did was not only did it create tremendous tension inside myself because somehow I felt like I was responsible for attempting to keep things under control, but it didn't allow important things to come up. And people would sometimes have a sense of being silenced because they were, or we would have ineffective strategies that just sort of tamped over ideas like band-aids. Um, and when I started studying conflict, I there was some point in the training where I was like, wow, I don't have to do that. Not only do I not have to do that, it doesn't even work to do that, and it makes it worse.
Right.
I'm actually making things worse. and and I started to recognize that first of all, a very obvious thing, but it's something that I think comes up in us over and over again, the desire to control other people,
Mhm.
that we cannot control other people.
Yeah.
And at one point I was going to Al-Anon meetings for something, and they said, you can't control people. Not only can you not control people, but it's none of your business what they do.
Mm.
And at the time, I was like, yes, it is, because it's causing problems and I need to help this. But over the years, over the decades, I'm fully more and more with that
Oh.
understanding that it's none of my business, which doesn't mean that I'm not impacted, then I can't have a response. But people have responsibility and the right to make their own decisions. And what I can bring to the situation is that I can speak about what I experience, and I can speak about the impact that people's actions have without tying them together. So, like we talked about before, without making it into, you made me feel like this because you do this because you're impossible and you need to change this. So that now I might get caught off guard with something. I might have some emotions spinning around. And what's shifted in me is that I really see emotions now as signals, as flags, like the needs are down at the bottom, waving these big flags of emotions. But often we just get stuck in the emotion and we just circle around unhelpfully. And people are like, I'm angry, or, oh, I'm just you. And rather than letting it do its work, which is to say, okay, I'm angry because I need a sense of autonomy, let's say. And then to begin to speak about, okay, how do I speak about autonomy and what that looks like in this situation and what that looks like in relationship to other people's needs, so that I feel like I have more internal mobility. If I get temporarily into a stuck place, I know, like you say, I have more confidence through experience of having tried to say, okay, all right, I'm right here right now. Now let me see if I step back from this. So this is not what I am. This is just what I've been doing or thinking. I can put it in the middle, like the Cujo thing, and I can say, okay, I can ask questions like, what don't I yet understand? What matters to me? What matters to them? What am I paying attention to? Which I think is a primary question that helps me if I notice that my attention has kind of slipped into some sort of defense or attack or justification or,
Mm.
you know, solidifying, like you say, solidifying the story, the old story, then I can say, oh, okay, that's the old story. That's me using the strategy of attack. So noticing the difference between what matters to us and the strategies we choose. You know, those get so bound up so often that people get stuck thinking their strategy is what they need, when in fact it's just one way of getting something done. So that I feel I have more access to be able to get down quicker to, okay, what matters to me, and what do I need to find out from the other person.
I love that because all my life I've heard about boundaries, placing boundaries, and I I feel like you were describing my life with conflict for decades of I'm just trying to manage everybody else. I'm
Mhm.
trying to minimize their emotional responses. I'm trying to, in a
Mm,
way, nullify it because I've got to make all these parties pacified so we can all get along, right?
mhm,
Prizing peace, the so-called peace above anything else. And while doing that, of course, I was harming them by not
mhm.
allowing them to have their own healthy emotional responses and deal with their own thing. But
Yeah.
I really see I harmed myself in that it was a ball of emotion, but I didn't understand what they were because all I knew was, happy, sad, angry, because
Mm,
I was just always out here just trying to manage. And so I didn't have to manage myself. I didn't have the bandwidth to look internally,
mhm,
and then the only kind of boundaries I could imagine were don't do that. Don't
mm.
have emotional responses because I don't want that. I want
Yeah.
peace. I'm not a drama person. I would just want peace. And those are like, how do you do that? Well, you don't do that, right? That's the problem. Like, I don't understand how boundaries work. People won't stop having these emotional outbursts around me, right? And now I'm still working on this, absolutely trying to understand my own emotional responses and
Mm,
then having healthy emotional, uh, just having a healthy emotional life, and then understanding how that goes into boundaries, that boundaries are mine to make and mine to keep, and what they
mhm,
realistically look like in healthy, authentic relationships. Like, how do I let people be dissatisfied or be angry or be in crisis? How
mm,
do I come alongside them uh, without losing myself, without trying to take away their own autonomy? And,
mhm.
it is the messiness of human relationships, but it's of course wonderful once when we work on that because we can have deeper, richer relationships. My relationships I couldn't allow to go very deep because I had to manage everything.
Mhm.
And I feel like now that I have stepped back, I have a lot more peace and I have now more space to be more honest with others and be more vulnerable, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see this people in people all the time too, is that when we start to be able to be present with difficulty and be able to be present with other people's emotional response and the connection to the needs, it's a relief.
Mhm.
And And people are always surprised by that. And I was surprised by that too.
Yeah,
I think that was that moment that I was just describing where I was like, oh, okay, I can just be here and be like, yeah, that sounds like sounds like you're really pissed off about that.
right.
Or you're really, really sad right now. And so often there's a desire in us to help people or solve for the problem. And that, of course, doesn't help people and makes, it creates a situation where people feel unheard and then they repeat. And, and I think that's one thing that's shifted in me a lot. And like you say, it's an ongoing process, to when emotional overwhelm comes in myself or in others, to be present with it long enough for it to distill down to what what it's trying to tell us
Mm,
matters. And actually, I stopped using the word management or resolution, like
mm,
conflict management or conflict resolution, because I find it gives this sense of we're like going to fix this thing and we're going to end it, or we're going to manage it, we're going to control it. None of which I've found through many years of, trying to do that works
mm,
or is of benefit to anybody. And so I've started thinking about conflict as a conflict engagement, that
Mm,
it's something we engage in over time, and we're going to keep engaging in it, and it's internal, and it's between us, and it's between us and structures, and it's a the more we can relax into, like you say, the real presence and the real ongoing presence of pain or challenge or excitement or happiness, all the different things that are inside this rich tapestry, the more we can relax with it, the more openness we have, the more it becomes possible. The more people are, the closer we can be with people because they don't feel like we're trying to manage them or
mhm,
or control them.
mhm.
And even if someone else tries to control us, we don't have to be we don't have to take up that structure. We can within that structure um, be curious about what they're caring about. You know, control is a strategy. So what are they needing around that? And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dana, it's my last question I'd like to end with. As you look
Hmm.
into the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only are workers treated with dignity and respect, but that they're encouraged to thrive and flourish?
Hmm. I think creating spaces where there's the possibility for difficulty to emerge in in a container that says it's okay to bring it up. It's important to bring it up. There's a going to be a process for how we talk about these things that doesn't devolve into blame and attack,
Mm,
but instead is about what's the information being brought up. And again, back to this question of what is this conflict proposing, so that we build together. So first taking a look at what is the current conflict culture, what's the impact of it, and then what kind of culture do we want to move toward, and what needs to shift in order to get there?
mm,
That's actually part one in one of my chapters of my book looks specifically at how organizations can look at conflict culture and kind of retool their conflict culture, not by having, like we talked about, not by having formulas, but by having a common mindset that opens up a space to say, okay, things are going to come up between us. And in order for there to be creativity and constructive change and ideas and failure and having all that be part of the process, to open up a space where it's okay for things to go wrong
mm,
because there's something behind that, and we can look at that, and that can be information for us too as we're creatively moving forward, whether it's in the work that we do in, I think dance is a great is kind of always a great model because in dance you're always starting from scratch and you're making a new thing, and you try a million things, and 80% of it doesn't really end up in the show. because, but you needed to try it
mm,
because you got information from it. So I think creating a creative space, opening up a creative space where people can think together, can allow for difficulty, can have grace for that difficulty to emerge, can see it with curiosity and see it as information, and have those things be functionally folded back into the structure and the ongoing thing. So if there's fake input sessions
mm.
where people say, okay, now we're going to gather input to change, but it doesn't ever get implemented, then that creates resentment and disengagement. So having leadership when they engage in uh, examination of systems and the change and looking to change, that they do it in a way that's authentic,
Mm,
that they authentically are looking for information and that they are going to actually do something with it so that people feel if they're being invited, that they're being invited for a real purpose
mhm.
and the collaboration is clear. What are each person's roles? What's happening with this information? Who's going to make decisions? Yeah.
And maybe asking the question, why aren't we doing this already? Right. I mean, and the studies bear out what happens when people have a sense of belonging, when there's
Yeah.
creativity, when there's buy-in. What is the barrier for not this untapped opportunity with the people already there, the untapped possibilities, creativity, all the things that happen when we make a space for for collaboration and for disagreement in a way that isn't destructive or unmanageable.
Yeah, and I think people get stuck, like you say, why isn't it happening? I think it's because people, back to our conversation around questions, people don't have a sense of how to even start.
Mhm.
And so I think having questions, and that's actually why I wrote this book, because it came out of years of working with different people, the kind of questions that seem to help people get going, and then keep going. So, how do we create not only a one time thing, but how does this become the way that we are with each other? Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to your book. So before we leave, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about conflict is an opportunity, 20 fundamental decisions for navigating difficult times?
I think it's all the things we've been talking about. So my first book, which was changing the conversation, was principles of conflict. So principles that you can always go back to, kind of like the Stoics have those principles. And this book is okay. As I'm going to these principles that I want to move toward, what is going to functionally help me? So it's a really taking it apart in a way so that you can integrate it in the end. And all these questions that we've been thinking about, what are the questions we can ask ourselves so that we can get more clarity, so that we can open up creative space, so that we can work together across difference, so that we recognize that we don't have to have full unity or full agreement to move toward constructive change. We can do it. And I think that's so important these days in the country, in the US and a lot of other places as well, to recognize that we're not stuck. We can move.
Yeah,
And this book is my attempt to offer kind of a little handbook of things that you can think about to help you move when you feel stuck.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dana, for your time. It's been an absolute delight talking with you today.
A real pleasure. Thank you, Mary.
Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.